Tonight, when it gets dark, go outside and look up. If you live in a city, you will see almost nothing. A gray, empty, orange-tinged sky. Maybe the moon. Maybe a handful of the very brightest stars if you are lucky. We have washed the night away with our own light, and most of us have never once seen the sky our ancestors saw every single night of their lives. Because their sky was not empty. It was on fire. Step out of your door 10,000 years ago, and the darkness overhead would erupt with light. Not a few dozen stars, but thousands upon thousands of them, crowding right down to the horizon, so many you could not begin to count them. And splitting the whole sky in two, a great pale river of hazy light, glowing, arching from one edge of the world to the other. We call it the Milky Way. They had 1,000 names for it, and no idea what it was. And that river of light was only the beginning of what filled their nights. Streaking across that sky, several times an hour, came shooting stars, sudden silent scratches of light, there and gone, that every culture reached to explain. A soul departing, a soul arriving, an omen, a wish. And moving among the fixed stars, brighter than any of them, were a handful of steady lights that did not twinkle and did not stay put. Lights that we would one day learn to call planets. But that ancient eyes simply saw as the brightest, strangest travelers in the whole glittering crowd. The ancient sky was not quiet. It was busy and deep and endlessly alive. So here is the question, hanging over every night of the ancient world. When our ancestors lay on their backs in the dark and stared up at that blazing, wheeling, silent sky, what did they see? What did they think it all was? And why did it matter to them so much more than it matters to us? Because make no mistake, it mattered more than almost anything. To an ancient human, the night sky was not a pretty backdrop. It was the single most important thing they ever looked at. It was their television and their calendar, their clock and their compass, their storybook and their scripture, all rolled into one enormous glittering ceiling that turned above their heads every night of their lives, perfectly, reliably, forever. This is the story of what they saw up there, and how looking up may have been the thing that switched on the human mind. Let's start with the thing everyone notices first. The moon. The moon is the easiest thing in the sky to watch because it changes. Night after night, it grows. A thin curved sliver, then a half, then a swollen full disk flooding the whole world with silver light. And then, just as steadily, it shrinks back down to nothing and vanishes, and a few nights later is born again. Anyone who watches it for a month sees a perfect repeating cycle. And somewhere, deep in the ancient past, a human being watched that cycle and did something no creature had ever done before. They counted it. We think we may have found the proof. Scratched onto ancient bones, some of them tens of thousands of years old, archaeologists have found rows of little marks. Notches, cut carefully in sequence, sometimes curving in sets, in counts that line up hauntingly with the days and phases of the moon's cycle. One famous bone carved in Africa carries columns of tally marks that people have argued about for decades. Another, from Ice Age Europe, seems to track the moon across 2.5 months, notch by patient notch. We cannot be certain what any of them truly mean. But the best guess is breathtaking, that these are tally sticks for the sky, that some of the oldest writing-like marks humans ever made were not words or names, but an attempt to keep track of the moon, to measure time itself, the month in your calendar right now. The word comes from the moon. Every ancient human who ever counted down to a full moon was doing the first arithmetic, the first calendar, the first science. And they did it by looking up, But the moon was only the small clock. The big clock was the sun. The moon gives you the month. The sun gives you the year. And the year was a matter of life and death. Watch where the sun rises on the horizon, day after day, and you will see it slowly slide north, then stop and slide back south, then stop and return in a great slow swing that takes exactly 1 year. Those 2 turning points, the longest day and the shortest, are the solstices. And knowing exactly when they were coming was, for an ancient farming people, everything. It told you when the cold would break, when to plant, when the herds would move, when the flood would come. Get it wrong, and your people could starve. So they did something staggering. They built the sky into the ground. All across the ancient world, people raised enormous stones and aligned them, with breathtaking precision, to the rising and setting sun on those special days. At Stonehenge, the whole monument is arranged so that on the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises directly over one particular stone. At a tomb called New Grange in Ireland, older than the pyramids, there is a slot cut above the doorway, and for a few minutes on the shortest morning of the year, and only then, a blade of sunlight slides down a long stone passage and lights up the deepest chamber inside. These are not decorations. They are machines. Calendars made of rock, built by people with no writing and no metal, so accurate they still work today, 5,000 years later. That is how badly ancient humans needed to read the sky. Now look past the sun and the moon, at the stars themselves. And here you notice the second great thing about the sky. It moves, but it keeps its shape. Watch the stars for a single night, and the whole sky wheels slowly overhead, rising in the east, setting in the west, turning around a single fixed point. But the stars never move relative to each other. The same patterns come back, night after night, year after year, life after life, unchanging. And a mind that had just learned to see a bison in the bulge of a cave wall was never going to leave those patterns alone. So people did the most human thing imaginable. They joined the dots. They looked at scattered points of light and saw a hunter, a bear, a scorpion, a swan, a great she-bear circling the pole. They drew pictures across the entire sky, and then they hung their stories on them. Because a constellation is not just a picture, it is a memory. Once you have turned a patch of sky into a hero or a monster, you can attach a story to it, a myth, a lesson, a warning, the deeds of an ancestor. And that story is now written in letters that never burn, never rot, and never get lost, and that every single person can see. The night sky became humanity's first great library, a place to store our myths and our gods where they could never be forgotten, printed across the one page that everyone on Earth shares and no one can ever tear down. And nothing drew the human imagination like that great pale river of light spilling across the whole sky. Almost every culture on Earth looked up at the Milky Way and saw the same kind of thing. A road, a river, a path. Some called it a river of milk or of stars. Some, a great celestial road that the souls of the dead walked after they died, climbing up out of the world and into the lights. Over and over, without ever speaking to one another, peoples across the entire planet decided that the sky was where you went when you died. That the dead were not gone, but up there, turning overhead, watching as stars. The same sky that held the gods held the ancestors too. When an ancient human buried someone they loved and then looked up at the night, they were not looking at empty space. They were looking at the place they believed that person had gone. And those pictures did something intensely practical too. They told you where you were and where to go. The sky is a map. The stars rise in the same places, wheel in the same circle, and, crucially, there is one star near the pole, that barely moves at all, that sits almost perfectly north all night, every night. Find that star, and you can never be truly lost. Ancient travelers steered by it across trackless deserts. And out on the open ocean, the greatest navigators who ever lived, the Polynesians, crossed thousands of kilometers of empty Pacific, from tiny island to tiny island, with no instruments of any kind, steering by nothing but the rising and setting points of the stars, a map of the entire sky memorized inside their heads. They found needles in a haystack the size of an ocean, using the ceiling of the world as their chart. And then there were the rule breakers. Because among all those fixed, faithful stars that held their patterns forever, there were a few bright lights that refused to behave. Night after night, month after month, they drifted, sliding slowly through the constellations, wandering against the grain of the whole sky, sometimes even stopping and doubling back on themselves. The ancient Greeks had a word for them: the wanderers. We kept it. We call them planets. There are 5 you can see with your own eyes, and to ancient people they were special and powerful, and clearly not ordinary stars at all. The most brilliant of them, the one that blazes low in the west after sunset and again in the east before dawn, was watched and worshipped everywhere. The morning star, the evening star, the herald of the sun. People who did not know these were other worlds, other planets like our own, knew one thing for certain. These moving lights were important. And so, over and over, across culture after culture, the wanderers became gods. But the sky was not only a clock and a map and a library. Sometimes the sky was a terror. Because just often enough to keep everyone afraid, the reliable heavens would do something horrifying and wrong. A star with a long, glowing tail would appear from nowhere and hang in the sky for weeks. A comet, which to almost every ancient culture meant one thing: disaster, a death, the fall of a king, a warning written in fire, and far worse, far rarer, and far more frightening. Sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary day, the sun itself would begin to go out. Imagine it with no warning and no explanation. The one thing you trust above all others, the source of all light and life, the great clock in the sky, slowly, impossibly, being eaten. A bite taken out of the sun, growing until the world falls into an eerie twilight. The temperature drops. The birds go silent and roost. The stars come out at noon, and a ring of ghostly fire hangs where the sun should be. To an ancient human who did not know what an eclipse was, this was not an astronomical event. This was the end of everything. Cultures across the world explained it the same terrified way. A monster, a dragon, a demon, a great wolf was devouring the sun. And so people did the only thing they could. They screamed and banged drums and shouted and shot arrows at the sky, anything to frighten the beast away and make it give the sun back. And every single time it worked. The sun always returned, which only proved to everyone watching that the ritual was necessary and had done its job and had to be performed again, exactly the same way, next time. Whole priesthoods, whole systems of power were built on that simple loop of fear and relief. If you were the one who knew the sun would come back, if you could stand up at the darkest moment and promise the terrified crowd that the light would return and then be proven right, you were not just a watcher of the sky anymore. You were its master, and people would follow you anywhere. And yet, out of all that fear, something extraordinary was growing. Because a few people somewhere were not just panicking, they were watching, and counting, and remembering. And slowly, across generations, they began to notice that even the terrors had a rhythm, that eclipses were not random, that the wandering lights had patterns. Some ancient peoples got so good at watching the sky that they could predict an eclipse before it happened. a feat that must have looked like the purest magic, and which made the watchers of the sky some of the most powerful people who ever lived. And think about who those watchers were. Somewhere, in culture after culture, there were people whose entire job was to lie out night after night in the cold and simply pay attention, to notice, to remember what their grandparents had told them, and add their own lifetime of observations, and pass the whole growing record on to the next watcher in the chain. No single human lives long enough to crack the rhythms of the sky alone. An eclipse cycle can be longer than a lifetime, which means that predicting one required something new under the sun. Knowledge, gathered by many people, carefully handed down across generations, built up patiently over hundreds of years into something none of them could have discovered alone. That is not superstition. That is the birth of science. The first great human project that no one person could finish, tended by the first astronomers, whose observatory was the bare ground, and whose only instrument was a pair of human eyes and a memory, and the patience to keep looking up. We even have their instruments. In Germany, archaeologists found a disc of bronze about the size of a dinner plate, more than 3,500 years old, inlaid with gold, a golden sun, a golden crescent moon, and a scatter of golden stars, including a little cluster that matches the Pleiades exactly. It is called the Nebra sky disk, and it may be the oldest known map of the heavens anywhere on Earth. A portable piece of the sky, in gold and bronze, made by people we tend to imagine as primitive, who were in fact carefully, precisely tracking the cosmos. So step back and look at the whole of it. For every single one of the tens of thousands of years before electric light, every human being who ever lived went to sleep under that overwhelming sky and grew up reading it. It ruled their calendars and their farming and their festivals. It steered their journeys. It held their gods and their dead and their stories. It frightened them, and it guided them, and it never, ever went away. The sky was the great constant fact of human existence. And we, in our lit-up cities, are almost the first humans in history to lose it. And here is what all that looking up actually did. Because it did something enormous. When an ancient human lay on their back in the dark and stared into that depth, they were doing far more than admiring the view. They were noticing that things repeat, that the moon has a cycle, and the sun has a swing, and the stars have an order. They were finding pattern in chaos. And the search for the hidden pattern behind things is the beginning of every science there has ever been. The sky was the first great problem the human mind ever tried to solve. It gave us mathematics as we counted its cycles. It gave us the calendar and the clock. It gave us navigation and the map. It gave us, very probably, our first gods, throned up there in the one place we could see but never reach. And above all, it gave us the question. Lying there, staring up, some ancestor of yours wondered, for the very first time, what is all that? How far away is it? What am I lying here underneath it? And in that wondering, that helpless, hungry, upward wondering, the human mind became something new. Because we are still doing it. This is the part that should stay with you. That impulse never died. We just built roofs over it and lit our streets and forgot. But it is still in you. It is there every time you step out on a clear, dark night, far from the city, and look up and feel that small, dizzy drop in your chest. That ancient mix of awe and smallness and longing. We still call it the heavens. We still say we are under the same stars. We still send our machines up to touch the lights our ancestors could only worship. Every telescope, every calendar, every clock, every spacecraft, every myth, and every religion that ever pointed upward began with a person lying in the dark, looking up, and refusing to look away. Think about what that means for a moment. the light from some of those stars set out toward your eye hundreds, even thousands of years ago, so that when you look up, you are not really seeing the sky as it is. You are seeing it as it was, a window into deep time, the same ancient light that fell on the upturned face of a hunter, a shepherd, a child, 10,000 years before you were born. You and that long-dead stargazer are looking at the very same photons of light. The sky is the one place where you can still, quite literally, see what they saw. The stars you can see tonight are very nearly the same stars they saw. The moon you can count is the same moon they counted. The sky above your roof right now is the oldest thing you will ever look at, and it is the exact same ceiling that hung over every human being who has ever lived, and wondered, and been afraid, and looked up anyway. So tonight, if you can, go outside, away from the lights, and do the oldest human thing there is. Look up and wonder. You will be in the finest company our species has ever kept. Thanks for watching. If you like the questions most people never stop to ask, subscribe and stick around, because next time we are digging into another strange, forgotten corner of the world of ancient humans.